So tonight I'd like to introduce Mary and welcome her back to Cocktails and Conversation. She is an assistant professor of art history at UTK, and her research focuses on intersections of American visual and legal culture. A lawyer as well as an art historian, Mary clerked for Judge Sharon Prost of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and continues to publish in legal journals, including the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism. Her work has received the support of the American Council of Learned Societies, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the University of Tennessee Humanities Center. So please join me in welcoming tonight Mary Campbell.
No. Oh, there. All right, now you can hear me. Okay, so thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's always a pleasure to get the chance to present here at the KMA, and thank you, of course, to David Butler and to Kate for setting the bar really, really high. All right, let's see if I can get over it. So tonight I'm going to be talking about Buford Delaney, an artist whom I really think of as our artist. All right, Buford Delaney, born in Knoxville, Tennessee, and after he died, Delaney pretty much fell into obscurity. So Delaney, he died in 1979, and the art world more or less forgot about him, but that's starting to change. We're in the early stages of a recovery of Buford Delaney. As the New York Times announced last fall, Delaney is returning to the scene with the help in large part of the Knoxville Museum of Art. So the KMA really at the forefront of bringing Delaney back to the scene. So just some basic information about Buford Delaney. As you can see here, he's born in 1901, born in Knoxville, Tennessee, and as I said, he died in 1979. His parents, Samuel and Delia Delaney, and it just feels really cheap having this image up here when in just a bit we're going to go into the gallery and actually look at this portrait, this gorgeous portrait of Buford's mother. And just to give you a sense of how it's going to work tonight, I'm going to take about 20 minutes to just give you, I think it's about 20 minutes, give you a general sense of Buford's trajectory, and then we're going to go into the show and look at some of the works and continue our conversation about Buford. So Buford Delaney, the son of Samuel and Delia Delaney. Samuel was a minister here in Knoxville, and his mother worked taking in laundry, cleaning other people's houses. There were 10 Delaney children. Yeah. Thank you, Marcia, for that salty commentary. All right, that was sort of my response as well. 10 Delaney children, including Buford's younger brother, Joseph Delaney, who was also an artist himself. So you can see Joseph here in front of his wonderful painting of the Williamsburg Bridge. And the Delaney brothers, they were incredibly talented artists and really gifted from the start. So the story is that they would sit in church, and rather than actually paying attention to the sermon, they just draw. They draw pictures out of the Bible, or if you let them go outside, they'd actually start digging in the dirt, our sort of wonderful, horrible Tennessee red clay, which is really terrible for gardening, but really wonderful if you're in it for the pigment, really wonderful if you're in it to start sculpting something. So the Delaney brothers, deeply, deeply talented, 2 out of 10, and 2 out of 10, most of whom didn't make it. And this is something about the Delaney family. They had 10 children, but only 4 made it to adulthood. Buford, Joseph, and then 2 other brothers. And that was another thing about Delaney before we get into the sadness here. People just really liked him. All right, Buford was by all accounts a wonderful person. So this is a comment from David Leeming's wonderful biography of Buford Delaney, a book that I really recommend reading. But as he said, in all my research, I've never met anyone who disliked Buford Delaney. So Buford Delaney, wonderful, right? You think about all of the people whom Leeming interviewed, all of the interviews, all of the research, couldn't find a single person who didn't like Buford. So Buford and Joseph, both extraordinarily talented, but as I mentioned, most of the Delaney children didn't make it to adulthood, and most of them didn't make it to adulthood because of the intense poverty in which they lived. So this is an excerpt from Delaney's diary, saying so much sickness came from improper places to live, long distances to walk to schools improperly heated, too much work at home, natural conditions common to the poor that take the bright flowers like terrible cold in nature. And sadly for Buford, one of the bright flowers that this sort of poverty took was his sister Augusta. So she died when she was 19 years old. She, at the age of 19, apparently weighed what she weighed at the age of 10. Yeah, it was really horrifying. Buford was 13 at the time. His sister was his best friend, and by all accounts, he never really recovered from her death. He always carried the sadness that came along from her death. So Buford, a deeply likable man, a deeply talented man, and a deeply sensitive man, someone who, as we're going to see, unfortunately, suffered a fair amount. Back to the sort of overarching trajectory, this man, anyone familiar with Lloyd Branson? Yes, all right, the local artist Lloyd Branson, born in 1853, died in 1925, educated in New York, then he went off to Paris, then he came back to Knoxville and started a portrait studio with a man named T.M. Schleyer, who was a photographer. Basically, Schleyer took the photographic portraits, Branson was in charge of the painted portraits, and they were really big figures here on the Tennessee Knoxville art scene. And the story is that one day, Buford, when he was pretty young, he was working shining shoes, and he forgot his sketchbook. And Branson comes along, he finds the sketchbook, he opens it, he realizes just how deeply talented Buford is. He goes and finds him, and he has him essentially start as his assistant, as his apprentice, helping him in the studio and also learning from him. And then here we see another Branson work, Still Life with Peaches from 1876, which was on display here as a part of the Romantic Spirits show. So Buford was working for Branson, and then in 1924, Branson helped to send Buford to Boston. In 1924, Buford Delaney left Knoxville and he headed out to Boston, and quite quickly he fell in with a really pretty rarefied set. So Buford gets to Boston and he's more or less hanging out with the upper crust, with these extraordinarily wealthy, well-educated, cultured, white, liberal Bostonians, what we might call the Boston Brahmins. And at the same time, he's hanging out with people like W.E.B. Du Bois, big figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And just quickly, the Harlem Renaissance, between the dates, the end of World War I, the onset of the Great Depression, with the 1920s really being the key dates for the Harlem Renaissance, this period of intense cultural and artistic production that goes on in various African American communities in the North, not only in Harlem, but also in places like Chicago and Boston. And it's playing itself out as an intellectual movement, as a visual arts movement, as a music movement. So you get people like Zora Neale Hurston, the writer, Langston Hughes, Dizzy Gillespie, Billie Holiday. You can really see what I'm talking about here. But you have big figures from the Harlem Renaissance in Boston during the 1920s, and Buford, he's hanging out with them as well. So you can see Buford, he gets to Boston when he's 23 years old, and he just starts sucking it up, right? Sucking up all of these cultural, intellectual, artistic sort of currents. And one thing that he really loves in Boston is music. So if you asked Buford when he was a young man what he wanted to be when he grew up, he wouldn't have said a painter. He would have said he wanted to be a singer. He had just this beautiful singing voice. He also played the guitar and apparently the ukulele. So he gets to Boston and he's just loving the music. He loves the popular music, he loves the jazz, and he also loved the classical music. And as we've seen, poverty, it marked Buford's life early, and it would continue to mark the rest of his life, sadly. So he didn't have a lot of money in Boston. What he had were friends, and friends who sometimes took him to hear the Boston Symphony, and he just loved it, right? Just sucking all of this up. Another thing that he really adores in Boston is the art. The formal art education. So Buford, he took classes at the Copley Society, at the South Boston School of Art, the Lowell Institute, and in addition to taking formal classes, he went to the museums. Went to the museums in Boston, and he'd sit in front of a classical nude and just copy it over and over and over again. So there's this sort of assumption that Buford Delaney was a self-taught artist from Knoxville, and that's his story kind of early on. But it doesn't remain his story for long. By the time he left Boston, he had more of a traditional, really solid art formation than the majority of artists gunning to really make a living through their art. He left Boston in 1929, and he went to New York City. He lands in New York in November of 1929. Not the best moment, really, to be in New York. Not the best moment to be in America when it comes right to it, down to it. The stock market had just crashed. So Buford, he goes to New York City in 1929. He shows up with very little money, no friends, and the story is he was promptly robbed. He shows up with the clothes on his back, a little bit of money, and because he loved music, a Victrola. Someone promptly stole his Victrola. He slept the first night, apparently, on a park bench. Somebody stole his shoes. Yeah, exactly. The man couldn't catch a break that first night. That said, he persisted. He kept going, and quite quickly, and you can see these are the wonderful works that he made, an example of the sort of work that he was making in New York City. And he fell in, despite the sort of unpromising shoeless beginning, he quickly didn't fall in, really made his way into the art world and became quite well known, at least within the art world, quite quickly making portraits, specifically portraits in pastel. Portraits, the sort of portrait you see here, this is his portrait of Henry Miller, the famous, quite scandalous writer Henry Miller, born in 1891, dies in 1980, probably most famous for writing Tropic of Cancer in 1934, publishes it in 1934. US promptly bans it, all right? But then in 1944, Delaney painted his portrait. And the year after Delaney painted this, Henry Miller published an essay called The Amazing and Invariable Buford Delaney. Yeah, it's great. I love having Marcia here, right? It's just like this wonderful commentary. All right, so in it, he describes the experience of meeting Buford Delaney for the first time, of going to Green Street in what is now Soho and going to Buford Delaney's apartment. So if you happen to have an apartment, a little studio on Green Street in New York now, how are you doing? You're doing well, right? You're rolling in it. You're like living by the Apple store. This wasn't the case in the 40s. So Buford's apartment, it was small, it was dark and it was apparently freezing. Buford would be in there wrapped up in all these layers of clothing, painting away, and Miller was just taken by this. So he wrote, you can see here, the environment of the creative individual, and here he's shooting way past Delaney. He's just talking about art in general. The environment of the creative individual must be composed of all the ugly, painful, discordant, and diseased elements of life. To prove, yeah, this is great. To prove his genius, the artist must transform these elements into durable symbols of beauty, goodness, truth, and light. And here we see this really romantic notion of what it means to be an artist, right? You've got to suffer. You've got to take all of these challenging circumstances around you, all of the painful, discordant, diseased elements, and you've got to alchemize all of this ugliness into a sort of beauty that can uplift and enlighten the rest of us. Very romantic notion. A notion that I think somebody like Peter Paul Rubens might have disagreed with, right? The famous Flemish painter, not really one who went in for the diseased, discordant, and poor elements, right? Not in that outfit. Also someone like our own Jared Sprecher, the just magnificent Jared Sprecher, also not really going in for the ugly, painful, discordant, and diseased elements. But this is Miller's fantasy of what it is to be an artist, and going into that studio on Green Street, seeing Buford in these really trying circumstances, freezing, wrapped up, and yet still making art, he finds a sort of archetype for his romantic artist. Finds something else too. And here we see Buford wrapped up in his sweater and his hat. But here, another quote from this article. Strange that in these men of dark skin, there's more light, more joy, more bliss, more contentment, more wisdom, more understanding, more compassion, more love. Henry Miller, a man who never met a superlative he didn't love, than in the member of the great white race. Strange that from the men who have nothing, not even freedom, we receive it in abundance. What's he saying here? This is where things start to get disturbing in the Miller article. You didn't realize that there's going to be like an audience participation part, right? But you have alcohol. My students don't. My ratings would be off the charts if they did. What's going on with this? What's he doing? Yeah, it's a sort of worship. And it's a perfect word for it, right? A worship that we refer to as primitivism. Right, but not many who were getting attention. Really recently, right? This sort of primitivizing language doesn't necessarily go away. You get to Jean-Michel Basquiat, people are still talking that way, looking at him. Yeah, seeing a primitive. Never mind the fact that, he started reading and writing when he was 4 and is extremely well-versed in all of the New York museums. I think he was a junior member of the Brooklyn Museum. He was a primitive, right, in this way that was going to come to white people and give them more everything. And primitivism, this very fraught sort of worship, a phenomenon according to which a dominant culture or people celebrates a supposedly less developed culture or people as primal, ancestral, fertile, potent, regenerative. You get the idea here. So we see Henry Miller engaged in some serious primitivizing language, which is not to say that he didn't absolutely adore Buford Delaney, but is to say that I think typically we think of racism as being either you're a racist or you're not, right? It's like a census. You could just check a box. Are you racist? Are you not racist? And we don't really think about the way in which just a sort of amorphous racism courses through our culture, right? That it's a sort of airless, kind of poisonous gas that we breathe in, and every once in a while those currents kind of snap to formation and have you saying things like this, engaged in this sort of primitivizing language. So Miller seeing Buford Delaney as a sort of primitive romantic artist. Another artist who adored Buford Delaney and didn't go in for all that sort of primitivizing stuff, Georgia O'Keeffe, the wonderful American artist Georgia O'Keeffe, born in 1887, died in 1986. Generally, if you only know one thing about O'Keeffe, you know the flowers. Flowers that typically get talked about in decidedly vaginal terms, right? Like, I defy you to go to 5 OBGYNs and find fewer than 3 who have one of these hanging on the wall, right? Never mind the fact that flowers are hermaphroditic, which is a little bit weird. Actually, not so weird, though, because Stieglitz, the great gallery owner, art photographer, and O'Keeffe husband, Alfred Stieglitz, he was the first person to start talking about O'Keeffe's work this way, handing over the female body in these decidedly vaginal forms, and we still kind of keep going with that rhetoric. The point here being that O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, they both knew Buford Delaney. That's what a solid part of the New York scene was. So O'Keeffe, she didn't do many portraits. This sort of figurative portrait was not O'Keeffe's thing, but she did it for Buford. Again, people liked Buford Delaney. Stieglitz knew him too. Buford Delaney he would often go to Stieglitz's gallery, An American Place, look at the work, listen to Stieglitz talk. Just a couple more examples of people, artists, New York artists whom Stieglitz knew. Charles Alston, just this wonderful family group from 1955, the just brilliant African-American painter Charles Alston, a friend of Buford Delaney's, and then Augusta Savage. You see her here. Augusta Savage, not only just a phenomenal sculptor, but also a teacher and a very prominent civil rights activist. Buford Delaney would go to her studio as well. So you can see Delaney, he was a serious part of the New York scene. And one more figure, because you can't talk about Buford Delaney without talking about James Baldwin. So the African-American writer, nonfiction and fiction writer, James Baldwin, also a really acute social critic, someone who was always very willing to take this really hard, unvarnished look at the sort of racism and sexism and even classism that runs through our American society. Baldwin met Buford Delaney in New York when Baldwin was only 16 years old. So James Baldwin, really looking to find himself in New York City, he finds Buford Delaney. And as you can see here in just this wonderful, wonderful photograph that just moves me, this sort of gesture of intimacy. Why am I not pointing here? Well, I'll use my hand. All right, see what we have going on here. Just the kind of intimacy that you have between Delaney and Baldwin. James Baldwin thought of Buford Delaney really as a sort of father figure, as a muse, as a guide. He referred to him as his spiritual father and would really be with Buford, and at certain moments would really take care of him for the rest of his life. And then Delaney returns the favor with just these glorious portraits that he paints of Baldwin. All right, just to give you an idea, and we'll see a couple of works from this moment in Delaney's trajectory when we go into the gallery, but to give you an idea of the sort of work that Delaney was making in the 1930s, 1940s, very early 1950s, this type of work where he's really simplifying New York City into his own sort of personal iconography. These signs, these symbols, whether it's street signs, or fire hydrants or grates, or even the birds, this sort of iconography that pops up repeatedly in Delaney's work from this period. And then we get to the key year for Buford Delaney. Key year, 1953. If you don't remember any other year for Buford Delaney, make it 1953, because in 1953, Buford Delaney went to Paris. His friends scraped together the money to send him to Europe, They got him a ticket on a ship called La Liberté, the Liberty. And they put Buford Delaney on the ship, and he sails for Paris. He actually didn't mean to stay in Paris. The original idea was that he would have just a very short stint in Paris, and then he'd move over to Italy. He'd move over to Rome. But he got to Paris. He set up in a little studio apartment at 15 Rue de l'Ambre, and he just stayed. The short trip became kind of a longer séjour, and then he just never left, right? He never went back to New York City. He did come home briefly to Knoxville in the winter of 1969, and we'll see some of that work in the gallery, but for the rest of his life, Paris was really home. And this is the sort of work that he started making immediately when he got to Paris. This is his early Paris work, his Paris window. And as you can see, he's deeply inspired by someone like Henri Matisse here, his interior with goldfish from 1914. But Buford's work, after he gets to Paris, it changes. And it changes quite radically. And this is one of the things that we're going to see in the gallery. But just to quickly, well, we'll finish up with the rest of Buford in the gallery, all right? Enough PowerPoint. If we can now just move into the gallery. Can we do this? If I keep the mic on, we can look at the work and talk about him in front of the work. All right, because it just seems silly to have you looking at a PowerPoint with the actual work. All right, so onward we go into the exhibit. All right, so this portrait that he painted of her in 1933, so he's 32 years old. And I guess the question that I have, and yes, and here we have Joseph Delaney, his brother. Again, just this wonderful. And as I mentioned before, when he gets to New York, people know him for the sort of portraits that he's doing in pastel, and it's this kind of work. It's this sort of work that makes his name in New York. But if you're just looking at the portrait of Delia, what kind of a woman do you think she is? Like, what sort of a sense do you get? Yeah, strong. All right, this is strong, compassionate. Other adjectives. What? Yeah, absolutely. All right, and the thing about Delia, so she's born into slavery. She's born in 1865. She never learned how to read. She didn't know how to write, and yet she had this sort of elegance about her, a certain sort of pride, and she instilled that in her children, Buford included. And she was a strong woman, a woman with whom one did not mess. But I find it really moving. In addition to cleaning houses and taking in laundry, she also worked as a janitor. She worked as a janitor at the KMA. So I imagine her here. Yeah, it's moving, right? I think about what she would think if she could see us now admiring her son's work. But this is Delia Delaney. And then moving here, just briefly, another just wonderful work. But this is the sort of work that, and really these three works, and something I'd call your attention to here, the medium, right? This isn't really fancy oil on canvas work. Why not? Exactly. Right? Buford was making work at a certain point on whatever he could find. But this is the sort of work that he was making in the 1940s, early 1950s in New York City. And you can see again, it's this work where he's taking the energy of the city, just his experience of the city, and really reducing it to these wonderful, this sort of stable of great symbols. There you find, again, the sort of swirls, street lights rather than street signs, but it's as though he were taking the city apart, really distilling it into a handful of symbols that he could then move around and play with, sort of like the phrasing in jazz even. And Buford, the musical Buford, he repeatedly made comparisons between his own work, his visual work, and the sort of rhythm and phrasing and improvisation that you find in jazz. All right, so moving here, but actually notice this work as well. There were only a few works I was going to talk about, and then the show's so wonderful, right, that you have to sort of take a moment for each one. But another wonderful New York City era pastel portrait of someone who really was quite famous, this Dante Pavone, who was a vocal coach, actually a vocal coach for Mick Jagger, which somehow moves me deeply. But that's my own particular... I think priestly vestments. And he really was a massive focus for Buford at a certain point. Buford spent a lot of time really making portraits of him. And so moving around here, we're going to get to, I am going to show some discipline, right, and steer us in the proper direction. But you start to see right around here the kind of change that you see in Buford's work after he gets to Paris. And again, that's why that 1953 date is so crucial for the story of Buford Delaney, is the way in which his work morphs after his arrival in Paris. So here, for example, a composition from 1958. So he had been in Paris for I can add, he had been in Paris for 5 years at this point. Rather lowball question here, what's different about this work? Yes, he has moved to abstraction, all right? And Marta, what is abstraction? Yeah, exactly. All right, and it's important to point out here. So you've got highly representational, illusionistic work over here. And when I say that, I'm talking about work that really seeks to seize the stuff of the outside world and represent it on canvas, paper, whatever, what have you. So something like the Mona Lisa, a painting that's actually hiding in a certain way, a board rather than a canvas that's saying, no, 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 I'm not a board. I'm not medium on board. In fact, I am a sheet of glass. I'm a window, and there's a woman behind me, and you can just look through this transparent sheet of glass and admire the scene beyond. And for really the better part of a century, well, maybe not fully a century, but starting with the High Renaissance and into, say, the middle of the 19th century, this was the goal of painting, to be as illusionistic, as representational, as objective as possible. And then in the middle of the 19th century, you start to get artists who play with that, who say, well, you know, we don't really have to show things as they are. We don't necessarily have to show anything other than the medium, other than the joys, in this case, of pigment on support. A couple things about abstraction. It's not a yes-no question. There's a scale. You've got something like the Mona Lisa over here and this Delaney over here, and artists playing all the way along the sort of range. So something like that Matisse I showed you, increasingly abstract, but still somewhat figurative. Here we are in the realm of pure abstraction with Buford Delaney. Another thing, abstraction, typically seen as the biggest development in art between, say, the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th. It's very rare as an historian that you can use a superlative like Miller, but you can say the move toward abstraction, the single most important development in the history of art during those 100 years. Another key point, abstraction, huge in France during the 1950s. So when Buford landed in Paris in 1953, the French had recently rediscovered Claude Monet. And who's Monet? He's an Impressionist painter, all right? In fact, it's his 1872 painting, Impression Sun Rising, that gives rise to the name Impressionism at all. And Monet later in his life, so he's born in 1840, he dies in 1926, and later in his life he retreated about an hour outside of Paris to a little town called Giverny. He had a house, these beautiful gardens, and he just painted, and painted these increasingly abstract canvases. Largely, he painted these just beautiful scenes of the water lilies that he kept in his garden. And in 1918, he gifted a whole series of these water lilies to the city of Paris. And the city erected a special building for these murals right by the Louvre, the Tuileries, a building called l'Orangerie, which is essentially the greenhouse for oranges. It's where, before they redid it, where all of the beautiful orange trees that lived in the royal gardens of the Tuileries, where they would winter. 1927, the city of Paris installs these beautiful water lilies in l'Orangerie, and no one cares. People don't really like Monet that much at that point. They figured that these water lilies, kind of the crappy painting he started to make when he was an old man and his eyesight was failing, and then the l'Orangerie gets bombed during World War II. Still no one cares that much. But then in 1953, they redo l'Orangerie, they open it, and suddenly everybody's in love with Monet. Suddenly they're looking at this abstract work with a whole new set of eyes, and that real fascination with abstraction, as you can find in those water lilies, that move to abstraction, the Parisians are loving it, and it has something to do with what's going on over here in America, right, in our art world. The first time where the international art world really interested in what's going on in America, and what was going on in America in the 1940s, 1950s. Abstract expressionism, all right? And I took a class one time at l'École du Louvre, the art school at the Louvre, and it was so gratifying because when we got to 1945, this French woman had to concede that art moved to America, right? And I'm like in the back, like, yes, we've been the country mouse so long. 1945, it moves to America with the development of abstract expressionism, a movement in painting where you have men, and they are by and large all men, expressing these really deep emotions through abstract paint on really big canvases. So the French see that, then they see Monet, and abstraction is the thing. And Buford Delaney comes over and he starts making abstract work like this, or over here, abstract work like this. And the color yellow, Buford Delaney had this really deep attachment to the color yellow, right? You can see over here, I mean, we've seen it in a lot of his work, but this work from about 1965. And as you can see, Delaney, he gets to Paris, he starts moving toward abstraction, and this is what he really finds. His style stays somewhat constant, or at least this sort of pure abstract painting remains a constant in his practice from that point on. And I'm just going to read you a little bit. This is from an essay written by James Baldwin, an essay called On the Painter Buford Delaney that he published in 1965. And in it, he talks about how Buford Delaney taught him to see. Right? Not literally see, but to really look, to really pay attention. And as he said, now what I began to see was not at that time, to tell the truth, his painting. That came later. What I saw, first of all, was a brown leaf on black asphalt, oil moving like mercury in the black water of the gutter, grass pushing itself up through a crevice in the sidewalk. And because I was seeing it with Buford, because Buford caused me to see it, the very colors underwent a most disturbing and salutary change. The brown leaf on the black asphalt, for example, what colors were these really? To stare at the leaf long enough, to try to apprehend the leaf, was to discover many colors in it, and though black had been described to me as the absence of light, it became very clear to me that if this were true, we would never have been able to see the color black. The light is trapped in it and struggles upward, rather like that grass pushing upward through the cement. It was humbling to be forced to realize that the light fell down from heaven on everything, on everybody, and that the light was always changing. So you can see Buford Delaney, his work doesn't reproduce well. His absolute fascination with light, with pigment, with the different shades of yellow. This is something that doesn't get captured in a photograph or reproduced in a magazine, reproduced in a PowerPoint. To really take in Buford Delaney, you have to be in front of the thing itself, really, when he's dealing with this sort of abstraction. So Delaney, with work like this, his pure abstractions, this is really the sort of high moment in his painting career. This is Buford Delaney at his aesthetic apotheosis, if you will. But it's also, by the time that we've gotten to 1965, he's also really hit at least one of the pinnacles of suffering. Because Delaney, he's this deeply talented, deeply sensitive, deeply loving guy, but he also was deeply plagued by demons. So when he was a teenager, he started hearing voices in his head. I think were he alive today, he probably would have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But in the 30s, in the 60s, there wasn't much support for this sort of mental issue, right? There wasn't much medical support. There wasn't much cultural support. So he basically just suffered with this, with these sort of mental breaks. And something he did get from Delia was this sense of pride, and also, I think, a sense of not showing weakness. And so he hid the sort of psychological problems he was having to some extent. He drank too much, and he suffered. And then in 1960, he suffered a really serious psychiatric break, what you might call a nervous breakdown. He was institutionalized, and he did manage to get it back together. So he came out of the institution, and he found in one of the really wonderful moments of his life that a bunch of his friends had again come together. This is a real constant in Buford's life. There was something about him that just drew people around him, drew them to support him. They came together, actually it was a couple, and they bought him a studio apartment. They bought him a studio in Paris where he could work. And this, for Buford, he loved the studio. And this represented a period of serious stability for him, both mental stability and really stability in his work. And yet the demons, they really persisted for him. So to read from Baldwin one more time, he says, "Perhaps I am so struck by the light in Buford's paintings because he comes from darkness, as I do, as in fact we all do. But the darkness of Buford's beginnings in Tennessee many years ago was a black-blue midnight indeed, opaque and full of sorrow. And I do not know, nor will any of us ever really know, what kind of strength it was that enabled him to make so dogged and splendid a journey." So Buford, he did really suffer, but he came out of that institution in 1960. He moved into his own studio. He continued to paint, and yet the demons continued to plague him. All right, and David Leeming thinks that actually painting was one way that he dealt with his demons, one way that he kept those voices in his head under control. It was a coping strategy, essentially, and it was a strategy that eventually failed him. So in 1970, Buford Delaney was institutionalized. Became clear that he couldn't really live on his own, and his friends had him institutionalized. They put him in Paris, St. Anne's institution for the insane, and he lived there until he died in 1979. Right, exactly. Shoot. So rather than linger on that, I just want to show you just a couple more, actually one more work. Rather than ending with the sadness here, I just want to focus on this beautiful work. It's not that sort of pure abstraction that we really know Buford Delaney for. Instead, this is an image of Tennessee. So in December of 1969, before he went into the institution, he came home to Knoxville. He stayed here until January of 1970. And you can see, again, just his attention to really seeing, to really sucking up all of the beauty of our Tennessee greenness and getting that down onto paper here in this watercolor. And so just to leave you here, and to leave you not simply with the work, but also to leave you with a real appreciation for how important the work that the KMA is doing with Buford right now really is. The KMA, it's a regional museum, and that's great, right? But in the sort of work that the KMA is doing, really pioneering Buford Delaney's return to the scene, that's not regional work, right? It's not even national work. Having this sort of show, the KMA is really on the cutting edge of a serious kind of recovery in the international art scene. So I think we should all just be quite appreciative of what really is going on in this little room. And to end with that, yeah, exactly, right? And just to give you a sense of how important Buford Delaney really is, just to end with this ending of this wonderful Baldwin essay, he writes, "Perhaps I should not say flatly what I believe, that Buford Delaney is a great painter, among the very greatest. But I do know that great art can only be created out of love, and that no greater lover has ever held a brush." So, yeah, exactly. All right, so I'll just end here and leave you looking at the work. I'm going to move back out into the other room, and if you have questions, please come ask me. But I'd really encourage you just to spend some time here and really soak up everything that's going on in this room. All right, thank you. Thank you.